Welcome back to part 2 in our 3-part series on St. Nicholas. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, there will be a link to that video in the description below. So how did Nicholas become Santa Claus and become connected to Christmas? And even more fundamentally, how did Christmas come to be celebrated in the first place? And did Nicholas even know about Christmas? Well, this transition happens over very many centuries throughout many nations. And it is an understatement to say it is a very complex story with many elements from several cultures all mixed together. It really is a complicated story. So I'm going to try to boil it down the best I can into the simplest storyline. Now, first of all, it may come as a surprise to you, but Nicholas himself never heard of nor celebrated Christmas because it was not officially named that by the Catholic Church until the 11th century. And remember, from the first part, he died in the mid-4th century. Further, he was not considered a saint, and that was the name by which he became connected with Christmas, until the 9th century. Now, although Christians were celebrating the birth of Christ as early as the 3rd century, there was no Christmas festival as such that looks anything like we know it today until, as we said, sometime in the 11th century. And also, Nicholas being called saint was largely based on the stories of his love, his generosity, and his care for the poor and especially children, as well as some miracle stories, true and legendary. And why did they tell stories about him? Because they loved him so much. And so many people told so many stories. Well, it so happens that Nicholas died on December 6th, and his feast day has been celebrated by Christians worldwide ever since. By the 11th century, Christmas Day was fixed and connected to the 25th of December. So think about it, it's in the same month as the time of the feast of St. Nicholas, that gift-giving saint. And the Nativity itself is the story of Christ, the greatest gift ever given to the world. Now, these ideas were merged together, resulting in our own gift-giving at Christmas. But it was Americans living especially in New York City who are largely responsible for morphing St. Nicholas into the Santa Claus that we know today. But they also commercialized and secularized Santa Claus by the 1940s. But they gave him such a large role and associated him with Christmas. Well, how did that happen in the first place? It happened in part because of the poem by a Dr. Clement Clark Moore. He was a local seminary professor and minister there in New York City. The poem was originally written in 1822 for his 3 daughters, and it was called by him A Visit from St. Nicholas. Now, we know it best by its more popular title, The Night Before Christmas. Well, this opening line of the poem permanently connected St. Nicholas to Christmas, especially after it was popularized in the early 1900s all over the country. Well, this poem created in our imagination much of the mythology surrounding good old St. Nick today. For example, Moore's poem was the source of the idea that Santa flies around in a magical sleigh pulled by flying reindeer, bringing toys to girls and boys all over the world on the night of Christmas Eve by coming down the chimney. And then Thomas Nast, just a little while later, he was a political cartoonist in the late 1800s, during the Civil War actually. He's going off of much of the image created by Moore, and he eventually adds to Santa his red fur suit and the fact that Santa lives in the North Pole, and he creates a naughty and nice list. And here you see on the left a picture of Santa looking down at all the girls and boys from the North Pole and creating his list there on the right, his lists. Now, after Nast, it fell to the art of a Swedish American by the name of Haddon Sundblom, who worked at the time for the Coca-Cola Company to finalize the famous image of Santa Claus that's familiar to us worldwide. And by the 1940s, the Santa Claus story, with all of its familiar trappings, become a permanent fixture of the Christmas holiday in American pop culture. And unfortunately, the real St. Nicholas became eclipsed by these secular and fantastical narratives, as did the birth of Christ. And it is because of this secularization that some Christians today struggle with the notion of Santa Claus. But, as we've asked earlier, can Santa be used to point to the true meaning of Christmas? Can we possibly peel back the layers and rediscover the real St. Nicholas, as well as Jesus Christ, whose coming we celebrate at Christmas time? Well, these are the questions we're going to seek to answer in part 3 of our series.